The house was on fire. Flames shot out of the windows, and thick black smoke filled the air. I stood outside, frozen, my chest tight as I struggled to breathe. My baby was still inside. I screamed his name over and over, hoping someone would save him. Tears streamed down my face as my knees gave out. I grabbed the fence to stop myself from falling. The fire roared louder, and the smell of smoke made my throat burn. Then I saw him, my husband. He came stumbling out of the house, coughing and covered in soot. In his arms he was carrying a child. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. My heart sank. The child in his arms wasn't our baby, it was someone else's. It was his ex's son. That morning had been peaceful. It was one of those rare, calm days. We had dinner together as a family, and our baby was giggling in his high chair. Everything felt normal. But looking back, I should have noticed the signs. My husband kept looking at his phone during dinner. When I asked him if something was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "It's fine. Just work." But his eyes avoided mine. Later that night, there was a knock at the door. A delivery. He grabbed the package quickly and tucked it away before I could ask about it. I didn't think much of it at the time. But then I saw her name on his phone, his ex. It popped up on the screen while he was cleaning up. When I asked, he brushed it off. "Nothing important," he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. I heard him on the phone in the next room whispering. I couldn't hear most of what he said, but one sentence stood out. "She doesn't need to know." My heart sank. What didn't I need to know? Who was he talking to? I wanted to confront him, but I stayed quiet, pretending I didn't hear. Hours later, I woke up to the smell of smoke. The house was already on fire. I panicked and ran to find my baby, but the flames were too strong. The staircase was blocked. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear me. My husband ran into the house while I waited outside, shaking, praying he would save our child. When he finally came out, I felt a moment of relief, until I saw the child in his arms. It wasn't our baby. It was his ex's son. My mind raced. Why was that child in our house? Why didn't he save our baby first? I couldn't breathe. The fire burned in front of me, but the questions burning inside me were worse. I stood there, frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. Who was the man I trusted? Why was this happening? The fire was finally under control, but my world was far from it. Firefighters rushed in and out of the house, their shouts echoing through the night. I stood there shaking, wrapped in a blanket one of the neighbors had given me. I couldn't stop staring at him, my husband, still holding his ex's son. I wanted to scream at him to ask him why. Why wasn't it our baby in his arms? But the words wouldn't come. The paramedics arrived and began checking us over. My husband placed the boy down on a stretcher, and as he turned back to me, I saw something in his eyes. Guilt. He looked at me like he knew what I was thinking, but he didn't say a word. Moments later, a firefighter approached us, his face serious. "We've got your baby. He's alive." Relief swept through me like a wave, and I nearly collapsed. They carried him out, his tiny body wrapped in a blanket, coughing but breathing. I reached out, taking him in my arms, tears streaming down my face. But the relief was short-lived. Anger and confusion bubbled up inside me. I turned to my husband, my voice shaking. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you save him first?" He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His silence cut deeper than anything he could have said. As I stood there holding my baby, flashes of the past started coming back to me. The late-night phone calls, the secretive behavior, the name on his phone. I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought crossed my mind. Was this fire even an accident? And why was his ex's child in our house in the first place? I decided not to confront him there, not in front of the firefighters and neighbors who were all watching us. But inside, I was boiling. The paramedics insisted on taking us to the hospital for a checkup. I sat in the ambulance, holding my baby close, while my husband sat in silence across from me. I could feel the weight of his guilt hanging in the air between us, but he still wouldn't explain. At the hospital, as the doctors checked over my baby, I finally had a moment alone to think. The questions in my mind were relentless. Why was his ex's child in our home? Why did he risk everything for that boy while our baby was trapped? Later, as we sat in the waiting room, I turned to him. "You need to tell me the truth," I said quietly, my voice firm. "Why was he there? Why did you save him first?" He looked at me, his face pale, his hands shaking. "It's not what you think," he started. But before he could say more, the nurse called us in for a follow-up with the doctor. His words hung in the air, unfinished, and my suspicion only grew. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft breathing of our baby, now asleep in my arms. The doctor assured us he would be fine, but my heart still felt heavy. My husband sat across from me, staring at the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. His silence was deafening. Once the doctor left, I turned to him again, my voice low but firm. "Tell me why he was there." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I was trying to help," he said finally, barely meeting my eyes. "Help who?" I snapped. "Because it wasn't me or our child you were helping. So who exactly?" His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his hair. "Her," he said quietly. "She called me earlier today. She needed help with something, and you brought her son into our home without telling me?" I cut him off, my voice rising despite myself. "Without asking? Without even thinking about how I'd feel?" "It wasn't like that," he said quickly, his voice pleading. "She was in trouble. She couldn't take care of him tonight, and I couldn't just say no." My stomach turned. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "So you put him above us? Above your own family? Above our baby?" "It wasn't a choice like that," he shot back, his voice finally rising. "The fire started so fast, I didn't have time to think. I just grabbed the first person I saw. You didn't mean to save someone else's child while ours was trapped inside?" My voice cracked, and tears filled my eyes. "Do you even hear yourself?" He reached for me, but I pulled back, clutching our baby closer. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear I was going to go back in. I would have gotten him too." "But you didn't," I interrupted, my words sharp as glass. "You didn't go back. You left him there. Our son could have died because you were too busy saving her child." The weight of my words hung in the air between us, and for the first time I saw tears in his eyes. He looked at me, broken, but I didn't feel sorry for him. Not yet. I needed answers, real answers. "Why was she in trouble?" I asked after a long silence. "Why did she call you? What aren't you telling me?" He hesitated, and I knew in that moment that there was more, much more, that he hadn't said. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Then uncomplicate it," I shot back. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the nurse returned to check on the baby. The conversation was cut short, but the tension between us only grew. As we left the hospital later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fire had destroyed our home, but it had also uncovered something even darker. I didn't know if I could trust him anymore, and that terrified me more than anything. The drive home from the hospital was suffocating. The baby was quiet in the back seat, his small breaths soothing but bittersweet. My husband kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence between us was thick, each second stretching longer than the last. When we finally pulled up to the temporary apartment his brother had arranged for us, I couldn't hold it in any longer. As soon as the door closed behind us, I turned to him. "Enough with the excuses," I said, my voice low but firm. "You need to tell me what's going on. All of it. Now." He froze, his back to me, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then he sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world rested on them. He turned around slowly, his face pale, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite read. "She called me," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said she was in trouble, that she needed help." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, crossing my arms. "She didn't tell me everything," he admitted, looking away. "Just that she had to leave town for a while, and couldn't take her son with her. She begged me to watch him, said she had no one else." My jaw tightened. "And you thought it was a good idea to say yes, without even telling me?" "I didn't have time to argue," he said, his voice rising slightly. "She sounded desperate, and I couldn't just ignore her." "But why you?" I pressed, my frustration boiling over. "She has friends, family. Why did she call you?" His silence was deafening. My heart sank, and I took a step closer, my voice trembling now. "Did she call you because she still thinks you're hers? Because she knows you'll drop everything for her?" "It's not like that," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I didn't want to help her. but I couldn't let the kid suffer because of her mistakes. And what about our child? I shot back, my voice breaking. What about the family you chose? What about us? His face crumpled, and he sank into the nearest chair, burying his head in his hands. I made a mistake, he whispered. I know I messed up, but I swear I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I stared at him, my chest tightening. For the first time, I saw something deeper in his eyes. Fear. Not just guilt or regret, but real fear. There's more, isn't there? I asked softly, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. What aren't you telling me? He looked up at me, his eyes glassy, and nodded slowly. She didn't just call because she needed help, he admitted. She said someone was after her. She didn't feel safe, and she thought they might come after her son. My blood ran cold. What? I whispered. Who's after her? And why bring her son here? Why bring that danger to our home? I don't know, he said, his voice rising in frustration. I didn't ask. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? I repeated, anger flashing in my eyes. The right thing would have been protecting your own family, but instead, you brought us into her mess. He didn't answer, his head dropping back into his hands. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what he'd said. Someone was after her. She'd left her child with him for protection. And now, our lives had been turned upside down. The fire wasn't an accident. I was sure of it now. Someone had been after her, and they had found her son in our home. As I stood there, staring at my husband, I realized two things. First, this wasn't over. And second, if I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. The baby was finally asleep in the makeshift crib we'd set up in the corner of the apartment. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater, but my mind was anything but still. My husband sat on the couch, his head resting in his hands. I couldn't look at him anymore. Every glance reminded me of how much he had kept from me, how much he had risked. I grabbed my phone and slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. If he wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. I started by searching her name, his ex. At first, it was the usual social media accounts and old photos, but then I found a news article buried deeper in the results. My heart pounded as I read the headline, Local Woman Under Investigation for Fraud and Embezzlement. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Fraud? Embezzlement? Why hadn't he mentioned this? I scrolled down the article, skimming for details. Apparently, she had been accused of stealing thousands from her former employer, and authorities believed she might have been connected to a larger network of financial crimes. That's why she was running. That's why she'd left her son with him. She was hiding, and she'd dragged us into her mess. My hands were shaking as I put the phone down. Anger bubbled up inside me, but so did fear. If she was in trouble with the law, or worse, dangerous people, then our family was at risk. My baby was at risk. I unlocked the bathroom door and walked back out, holding the phone tightly in my hand. My husband looked up, his face pale. We need to talk, I said firmly. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he saw the expression on my face. What is it? I held up my phone, the article still open on the screen. Did you know about this? I asked, my voice trembling. He glanced at the phone, his eyes widening slightly before he looked away. That was all the answer I needed. You did know, I said, my voice rising. You knew she was in trouble, and you still brought her son into our house without telling me. She said it wasn't true, he argued, his voice defensive. She said she was being framed, and I believed her. I didn't think. That's the problem. I cut him off, my anger boiling over. You didn't think. You didn't think about what this would do to us, to me, to our baby. You just acted like her savior, like she's still your responsibility. He stood up, his hands out in a placating gesture. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he said. I was just trying to help. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? I laughed bitterly. Do you even understand what you've done? The fire wasn't an accident. Someone was after her, and now they're after us because of you. His face paled even further, and he took a step back. What are you saying? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'm saying that whoever set that fire wasn't just trying to scare her, I said. They were trying to send a message, and you've put all of us in danger because you couldn't say no to her. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. Finally, he spoke. What do we do now? I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. I don't know, I said honestly. But I do know one thing. I can't trust you anymore. Not until you start being honest with me about everything. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. I'll fix this, he said quietly. I'll make it right. But I wasn't sure if I believed him. The weight of what I had uncovered hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. My husband sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands, while I paced the room, unable to stay still. Every second felt like a countdown to something worse. Someone had set that fire. Someone had been after her, and now they could be after us. We can't just sit here, I said, stopping mid-step. My voice was firmer now, laced with determination. We need to know who did this and why. Sitting around waiting for the next attack isn't an option. He looked up, his face pale but serious. What do you want me to do? Start by telling me everything, I said. No more half-truths, no more protecting her. If we're going to figure this out, I need the full story. For a moment, he hesitated, as if deciding whether to trust me. Finally, he nodded and began to speak. She called me out of the blue, he said, his voice heavy. Said she was in trouble and that she had no one else to turn to. She sounded terrified. I asked her what was going on, but she wouldn't say much, just that people were after her and that she had to leave town. She begged me to take her son, just for a little while. I folded my arms, my jaw tightening. And you didn't think to ask why she was being chased? You just said yes? I did ask, he said defensively. She told me she was being framed, that it was a misunderstanding. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't just leave her kid out there. He's innocent in all of this. And what about our child? I snapped. Did you think about how bringing her problems into our home would affect him? His face fell, and for a moment, he didn't answer. I didn't think it would get this bad, he admitted finally. I thought it would just blow over. Well, it hasn't, I said sharply. Someone tried to kill her and her son, and now they've put us in their sights. He looked down, his hands clenched into fists. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. His apology did little to calm the storm raging inside me. But I couldn't let my anger distract me. There was too much at stake now. What do we know about these people? I asked, forcing myself to focus. Who's after her? He shook his head. She didn't say much, just that they're dangerous and that she had to disappear. I grabbed my phone, pulling up the article I had found earlier. She's not just running from them, I said, scrolling down the page. She's under investigation for fraud. If this is connected, it's not just her running. She's hiding from the law, too. His eyes widened as he leaned forward, staring at the screen. Fraud? Embezzlement? He read aloud. She didn't tell me any of this. Of course she didn't, I said bitterly, because she knew you'd still help her. She knew you'd do whatever she asked. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped, knowing I was right. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment he looked completely lost. We need to find her, I said, cutting through the silence. If we're going to get out of this mess, we need to know what she's done and who she's running from. How? He asked, looking up at me. She didn't tell me where she was going. She didn't tell me anything. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice firm. But I'm not letting her drag us down with her. Not anymore. He nodded, and for the first time that night, I saw a spark of resolve in his eyes. Whatever it took, we were going to uncover the truth. And this time, I wasn't going to let him handle it alone. The next morning, I was up before the sun, my mind racing with plans. My husband sat at the kitchen table, his face pale and drawn, but for once he looked determined. I could tell he was ready to face whatever came next, or at least he was trying to be. We need to start with what we know, I said, spreading out the few pieces of information we had. She called you. That means she trusts you, or at least thinks you'll help her. Did she leave anything behind when she dropped off her son? Any clue about where she might have gone? He shook his head. She barely stayed 5 minutes. She didn't even come inside, just handed him over, said thank you, and left. I frowned, frustration bubbling up. Then we start with her connections. Who does she know? Where would she go if she was in trouble? He hesitated for a moment before answering. She used to have a sister in town. I don't know if they're still in contact, but it's worth a try. We spent the next hour digging through social media, searching for any sign of her sister. Finally, we found an old profile, but the last update was from years ago. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I'll go check it out, he said, standing up. You should stay here with the baby. No, I said firmly, meeting his eyes. We're in this mess because you decided to handle things alone. Not this time. We'll figure this out together. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the look on my face. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. Together. The drive to the sister's address was tense. Neither of us spoke much, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. When we arrived, the house looked abandoned, shutters closed, the yard overgrown. But as we walked up to the front door, we heard movement inside. He knocked firmly. Hello? Is anyone there? For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door cracked open and a woman peeked out. Her eyes were sharp, wary, but they softened when she saw my husband. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice low. We need to find her, he said, cutting straight to the point. She's in trouble, and now we are too. Do you know where she is? The woman's face hardened. I don't know where she is, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. She's done enough damage to this family. Please, I interjected, stepping forward. Whoever she's running from set our house on fire. My baby was inside. If you know anything at all, we need your help. The woman's eyes flickered with something. Pity, maybe, or guilt. She opened the door wider, gesturing for us to come in. She's not here, she said as we sat down in her cluttered living room. But I know who's after her. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. Who? She got involved with some bad people, the sister explained. A group that runs a fraud ring. She was their bookkeeper, but when things started to fall apart, she tried to cut ties. They didn't take it well. Do you think they're the ones who set the fire? I asked. The woman nodded grimly. If she owes them money, or worse, if they think she has information that could incriminate them, they'll come after anyone connected to her. Including you. I felt my stomach drop. This was worse than I had imagined. Do you know where she went? My husband asked. The sister hesitated, then sighed. She mentioned a motel near the edge of town, said she'd lay low there until things blew over. It wasn't much, but it was something. We thanked her and left quickly, my mind racing with questions. If we found her, could we reason with her? Could we convince her to make things right before it was too late? As we drove toward the motel, I glanced at my husband. For all his mistakes, I could see that he was just as scared as I was. But there was something else in his eyes, too. A determination to make things right. I just hoped it wasn't too late. The motel sat on the outskirts of town, its neon sign flickering in the dim evening light. It looked as run down as the situation we were in, paint peeling from the walls, a few scattered cars in the parking lot. My husband parked the car, and we sat there for a moment, neither of us moving. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice heavy with doubt. No, I said honestly, clutching the baby monitor I'd brought to keep an ear on our child, who was now asleep at his brother's house. But we don't have a choice. We stepped out of the car and walked toward the front office. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up as we entered, his eyes glued to a small TV in the corner. My husband cleared his throat. We're looking for someone, he said. A woman, early 30s, black hair, medium height. She might have checked in recently. The clerk shrugged, flipping a page in his logbook. Room 12, he said lazily, pointing down the dimly lit hallway. But if you're here to start trouble, I'll call the cops. We just want to talk, I said quickly, pulling my husband toward the hallway before he could respond. Room 12 was at the far end. The door was slightly ajar, and my heart pounded as we approached. I glanced at my husband, who nodded silently. He pushed the door open gently, and we stepped inside. The room was small and dingy, with a single bed and a suitcase lying open on the floor. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. When she looked up and saw us, her eyes widened with shock. What are you doing here? She asked, standing quickly. What are we doing here? I repeated, my voice sharp. What are you doing, dragging us into your mess? Someone set our house on fire because of you. My baby could have died. Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the bed. I didn't mean for that to happen, she said quietly. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Then why did you bring this to us? My husband demanded. You could have gone anywhere, but you showed up at our door. Because I didn't know where else to go, she snapped, her voice trembling. They're after me. Okay, I thought if I left my son with you, they'd leave him alone. I didn't think they'd come after you too. I stared at her, disbelief and anger bubbling inside me. You thought leaving him with us would make him safe? I said bitterly. You didn't think about what it would do to us, did you? She buried her face in her hands. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. They think I have something that belongs to them, a ledger with all their records. I don't, but they won't believe me. Do you? My husband asked, his voice low. She hesitated, and my stomach turned. Finally, she nodded. I took it, she admitted. I thought if I had it, I could protect myself, but it's only made things worse. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Where is it? I asked. It's in the suitcase, she said, pointing to the corner of the room. But they'll kill me if I give it back, and if I don't, they'll kill me anyway. My husband grabbed the suitcase and opened it, pulling out a small, leather-bound book. He flipped through it quickly, his face grim. This is what they're after, he said, handing it to me. If we give it to them, this ends. Or it doesn't, I said quietly. If they've already crossed the line this far, what's to stop them from coming after her, or us again? We stood there in tense silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of us. Finally, I spoke. We can't do this alone, I said, looking at my husband. We need help. Real help. You mean the police, he said. Yes, I said firmly. This isn't just about us anymore. They've hurt too many people. It's time to end this. The ex looked up at me, fear in her eyes. If you go to the police, they'll come after me harder. They'll kill me. Not if we do this right, I said, meeting her gaze. But if we don't, none of us will be safe. You brought us into this. Now you need to help us get out. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Okay, she said. I'll do whatever it takes. The next few hours were a blur. We contacted the authorities, explaining everything. Her involvement, the fire, the ledger. They promised to handle it, but I couldn't help feeling that this wasn't the end. As we left the motel, I held my husband's hand tightly, the baby monitor still in my other hand. We had survived this, but I knew things would never be the same. Trust had been broken, and the scars of what had happened would stay with us forever. But for now, we were safe. And that was enough.